All right. Well, it looks like we've reached a nice critical mass here, and we'll get started. Just to introduce ourselves, hi everyone, welcome. My name is Adam Friedman. I'm the organizing election strategist at Interfaith Alliance, and I'm excited to turn it over to our president and CEO, Paul, to introduce himself.
Hey everybody, my name is Paul Raushenbush. I am really delighted to be hosting this webinar tonight and really excited for the information and also to be in community with all of you joining us tonight. So a really important moment in our country and just really glad we can share this moment of getting prepared, getting aware, and really showing solidarity with one another.
So the first thing I just want to mention, a real impetus for this webinar is that it's National Voter Education Week this week. So happy National Voter Education Week to y'all on the webinar this evening. Uh, as you know, for those of you who've been following Interfaith Alliance, we are focused not only on confronting Christian nationalism through this election season, but broadly in the United States, day after day, year after year. And one thing we've really been focused on this year is how we not only respond to the Christian nationalist rhetoric that's creating a unique sense of urgency and threat to democracy this year, but how we lead with a pluralistic vision of the democracy we hope to achieve. So before we jump into some of the content we'll be going over this evening, I just want to flag the QR code we have in the bottom left corner of your screens, which will take you to our 2024 issue primer. In that document, there are 4 different issue areas. We've worked with a number of different leading research organizations and authors to compile Christian nationalist language and rhetoric that's showing up uniquely this election year, as well as some language and talking points to help you deconstruct that rhetoric for your community members and lead with a positive, pluralistic vision of democracy. So I just wanted to lift up that resource as something that I've been looking to guide me through this National Voter Education Week and through the election. We hope you find it helpful. So we know that there are a few new folks on the call, so we want to just start off today with our table of contents. First off, mentioning a little bit about who we are, who is Interfaith Alliance, what's brought us to this moment. We're going to be discussing briefly just what Christian nationalism looks like and how we're understanding it right now before really getting into the nitty-gritty of what kinds of narratives we're seeing emerge from the world of Christian nationalism and the New Apostolic Reformation going into this final month before November 5th. We can't talk about that without addressing the risk of political violence, which is something we'll do as well. And then we have 5 tangible, immediate things you can do, you can lead your community in doing to prepare yourselves for this election season. And so we're really excited to go over those steps so we can all feel prepared going into this next month. And finally, we have some really exciting programs that we're leading as Interfaith Alliance focused on getting out the vote, increasing voter participation, as well as protecting the election and ensuring the integrity of our electoral processes that we'll be closing with at the end. And then, of course, we have some time for Q&A. So just to briefly introduce our work, as Interfaith Alliance was founded 30 years ago as an advocacy organization to counter the rise of what was then referred to as the religious right. Since then, we've developed affiliates in states across the country, as well as working in interfaith coalition across diverse faiths and beliefs to really forge relationships at the local level and push for legislation to protect people of diverse faiths and beliefs and confront the misappropriation of religion through policy. So that's looked like a number of different programs, but one of the big ones we like to talk about is really leading the way as an interfaith coalition securing marriage equality, as well as preventing the rise of hate crimes and strengthening hate crimes reporting. I know I mentioned this briefly, but I also want to mention that we were founded by Reverend Walton C. Gaddy, who is a really incredible faith leader and has really pushed the conversation in the world of faith to recognize the necessary division between church and state and help especially Christians around the country see how they can lean into their values to lead through this moment when Christian nationalism is on the rise. So it's a little bit about us, but I'm very excited to turn it over to Paul to speak a little bit more about what we can expect this election year.
Okay. Hey, everybody. I just wanted to start with, the broad ideas about Christian nationalism. It is, you know, this is something that is a term d'art around this fusion of Christian identity and nationalism, which essentially makes the claim that Christians have a privileged position in our country based on the myth that this country was founded as a Christian nation, and that our special favor is dependent upon us maintaining that special identity. And I think that, it's just important at every moment to say the non-establishment clause in the Constitution actually directly contradicts that idea. We were not founded as to be any one tradition in our country, and it's really important to lift that idea up and to recognize that. That one of the reasons we have a flourishing religious community that is diverse is because of the non-establishment clause, because we don't have a national religion. And it's an important point that at our founding, one of the things we got most right was that no one religious tradition has a privilege over another. And George Washington talked about that. Jefferson talked about it. It's just really important to underscore that. So anybody who says this is a Christian nation is rewriting history in order to give themselves more power. We see that happening a lot right now. And so this idea of fusing religion and civil life, as in, some people believe that actually Christians, and by Christians, they certainly don't mean the kind of Christian that I am as a Baptist minister. I don't count the many millions of people who represent the different traditions. They mean Christians made in their own image are meant to control all aspects of life. This is essentially a theocratic movement and it's a political movement and a quest for power. And underneath all of it is a kind of very specific understanding of who should be in control. Namely, it is a white supremacist movement. It is a patriarchal movement. It is one that strongly believes that, of course, LGBTQ people have no rights. But then, underneath all of that is that Christians are the religion of America, and others are less than. And if you have any questions about that, look up the Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport in the late 1700s. And he said that we no longer speak of any one group being tolerated. In fact, everyone has equal rights under this country. So it's really important to establish what that is. Part of what we are seeing, right now in the election is this idea that is very much being preached and very much being promulgated, that we have a candidate that has been anointed by God. And I really, part of my thinking right now is very influenced, I will say, by Matthew Taylor's new book, The Violent Take It by Force. If you haven't read it, it just came out. A shameless plug for The State of Belief, which is the podcast that Interfaith Alliance supports. I have a great interview with Matthew Taylor, but he really gets into this idea that that we have that Christian nationalists are using the idea of an anointed candidate that is God's candidate, and that God's candidate, of course, cannot lose. And so we're in a moment where when you are being when push comes to shove, where democracy and the people's vote comes up against God's anointed candidate, well, Christian nationalists have a very clear understanding of what has to give, and what has to give is democracy in that moment. And we have a lot of the use of spiritual warfare that we're up against, that there's the good forces of good, which is always their side, and the forces of evil, which is always the other side. And this is a very, also an extremely extremely dangerous way to understand a democracy. It just doesn't function in a democracy because democracy is based on compromise and coming to consensus and moving forward as a people. And when you have the other side being painted as demonic, there's no compromise with the devil, and so a lot of this kind of language is being is infiltrating the rhetoric of this race, as it has for the last several years, several cycles. And this is again one group claiming, one, that this is a Christian nation, and two, that they are responsible for saving it. And we're in a moment where essentially there's we can go to the next slide. There's this kind of an apocalyptic understanding of the stakes, meaning, after this, there's no future. And so this is an important slide for those of you who want to, a little bit more about religious Christian nationalism. Essentially, the idea is who was America made for? And we're seeing this come up, unfortunately, a lot right now. And you're hearing it a lot in the idea of who belongs. And the idea God intended America to be a promised land where European Christians could create a society to be an example for the rest of the world. This is an extraordinary statement that unfortunately, like, huge numbers of Christian nationalists agree with adherents close to over 80%, and sympathizers in this high 60s. And so what that means, when we hear rhetoric around non white people, immigrants, non-Christians, all of this is about who belongs again. And so this slide shows kind of the way this is really already coming up in our political rhetoric, which is just so terrible. Which is that we saw that. I mean, this incredible made up story around Haitians, in Springfield, that has been doubled down. They refuse to recant this. And it's all based on this idea that there's a purity of blood. Recently, one of the candidates said that, our genes are being diluted. There's a poisoning of the bloodstream. Great replacement theory is very tied to this. Great replacement theory is this idea that there's an effort to bring in non-white people into the country, and it largely is that the Jews are behind this, so it has an anti-Semitic trope, and it essentially this is something that has become almost commonplace to hear in our current political climate. And so we are seeing, unfortunately, these things that just seem it should be shocking to us are becoming mainstream in this current cycle. And the damage, where whoever wins this next election, in whatever 28 days, the damage is going to be very hard to undo. The language is out there. And the way people will understand the results of this election, given the conversation about God's candidate and who God favors in this, which is one of the most important things. And I know I'm beginning to rant, but I feel ranty about all of this, is that before January 6th, they were doing prayers and all of this, and it was because they had been convinced, and they had, the people who were like the bloodstream of this January 6th movement had been convinced that Trump was God's candidate and therefore could not lose, meaning it just cannot lose. And that's the reason they are having such a hard time, and refusing to concede 2020. So we've kind of gone over this spiritual warfare. I introduced that a little bit earlier, the good versus evil, which is very, all of us want our side to win. That's we have to be honest, all of our side really, we're the good guys. Of course you think that, but to paint this actually as a cosmological struggle, and that ultimately, this is God struggle, good versus evil. It brings it into a dangerous zone, and I'm not sure how easy it will be to pull back from it. And unfortunately, we're in a moment where people are really finding meaning in this kind of rhetoric and this kind of worldview. So what it really points to is that those of us who, we want our side to win, but we've been through cycles. Like, I'm 60 now. I've been through cycles when I've lost. I've been through cycles when I won. There was always okay, so next cycle, let's figure it out. The real question is, do people really believe in the possibility of democracy? And I would say that Christian nationalism and how it is intersecting with our democratic process right now is making that question really important. Do you really believe in democracy? Will you concede to fight another day, or must your candidate win? And so I think that we are in a really, really important moment. And what we're going to get into, I think soon, or after this slide, next slide, is really like what we can do, because there are so many of us who are going to be working together to protect our election, to protect our polls, to protect one another, and to show up with one another. And I think this is the time for all of us to really make a commitment to what we can do in this time. So I think this is the moment when I turn it back to Adam, who's actually not. Oh, we have violence. Oh my God. Okay. This is the last thing I'll say that's negative, and then I'm gonna do it really quick, and then we're gonna zip to. But unfortunately, those who identify as Christian nationalists are 7 times more likely to say violence may be necessary. Because things have gotten so far off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence to save our country. So the threat of violence in this moment is not theoretical. I mean, we've already seen violence, and we saw violence we've seen violence in many ways over all of the history of our country has been violent in many ways. But the violence and and how it intersects with elections is, unfortunately, we've seen that. We saw that with people threatening the state house in Michigan and threatening to kidnap the governor. We saw that in January 6th. Violence is not a theory. And so what can we do, recognizing, let's do one more slide to make sure I'm not like jumping. No, here we are. Okay, yay! All that like, bummer. It's true, it is a bummer, but it is also true that over the years, there's been so many difficult times that our country has been through, and that people of faith and goodwill have come together and overcome them. And we're in another moment like that. And it means really about reaching out to one another and showing up for one another and trying not to demonize one another, and really stand or show up for democracy in this moment. So I'm going to turn it back over to Adam to talk a little bit about that, and I look forward to more conversation.
Thank you so much, Paul. And I'm sorry, you teed up this transition so beautifully, and then we had to talk about political violence, which is, I agree, it's always a downer, and something that's really important to name, right? Because we know the stakes, and we know what we can do about it. We know what we can do to prevent this risk, and how we can engage with our communities to really bring folks together ahead of this moment. So again, thank you for talking a little bit more about what Christian nationalism is looking like right now, and how we can really understand it, call it out. And now we're going to get into a little bit of what we can do in community with one another to prepare for this moment. So you'll see here are 5 things on our election checklist to prepare yourself, your community, for November 5th and the following months. I'm going to quickly go through these because we have a slide dedicated to each one, as well as an action item that you can take on each slide. But just to give you a flavor of this, right? These first 3, which are in light blue, are really around the work we do in community, right? Reaching out, showing up, building solidarity across lines of difference, showing up for the people who face the most risk, creating a plan, preparing. We know every person on this call is a leader in their community. By creating a plan with folks you work with, folks you're in partnership with, you can prepare for different potential outcomes and be ready to support your community through whatever election outcome we see, as well as whatever happens, that week following election night. And the final piece of this community work that we think is so important is being a real messenger of truth, right? Not just addressing mis and disinformation, but really sharing accurate information, being someone who can assure the community that our election administration is strong, that we can come together and vote, and that is how we change the course of the direction of our country. And by investing in democracy through voting, we are in a way perpetuating that ability, right? We are ensuring that the ability to weigh in and have that be the tool we use to shape our country be something that continues into the future. Now, these last two white check marks are these active kind of campaigns that we're engaged with that we want to share with y'all. One is directly around election protection, and we have some opportunities that we're sharing specifically for clergy, as well as opportunities you can do virtually and in person through early voting and election day. And then we also have a really incredible text banking campaign in 2 states kicking off next week that we're going to share a little bit more about, along with some other initiatives at the end of our call today. So to get into these 5 things, the first one I want to get into a little bit more detail around is reaching out, showing up across lines of difference. We know this has been a really, really hard year for interfaith relations. This has been a really difficult year for a lot of folks in their communities, not just because of what's happening, in other countries, but what's happening in the United States. The FBI released their 2023 hate crime statistics, and we saw the single highest number of bias incidents against minority faith communities since these statistics were recorded. And I'll specifically name the Jewish community, the Muslim community, and the Sikh community as the 3 most targeted. We know that folks in minority communities are afraid, are hurting, been very directly impacted in new ways this year. And it's also hard to go to folks who are experiencing this pain and might be facing direct threat and say we're here. And so that's why we really think in this moment around the election, there's a unique urgency that provides a platform for all of us to come together, right? We know that folks who are hold identities and are in communities that are predominantly made up of identities that are safe in this moment, right? A lot of white Christian communities right now, right, are feeling safe in comparison to some of our minority faith communities right now. We know that folks in those communities are primed and prepared in many ways to show up for minority faith traditions that have been targeted by hate this year and in years past. And we also know that there is a heightened risk around the election, not only due to candidate rhetoric, but also due to the actions and threats of different groups operating on the ground. And so reaching out to folks, especially clergy and faith leaders, and saying, we are here, we are ready to show up for you. Let us know not only how the best way to show up is, but offer some tangible steps. One thing that I was talking about with a researcher recently who focuses on community preparedness is this idea that white Christians and clergy especially showing up out front of the doors of synagogues, masjids, and gurdwaras in the religious attire is one of the strongest ways to prevent hate-based violence and attacks on houses of worship. We'll say in the same vein, we'll talk about this in a moment, but clergy showing up in their religious garb after training, of course, to the polls as poll chaplains is one of the strongest ways to prevent political violence. And so there's a program that we're a partner of that we'll be naming here and pulling up a QR code for. But I just want to name that there are tangible things we can do right now. I know there are a lot of clergy around the country who haven't been sure exactly what the places of their specific denomination in showing up for other communities or addressing hate this year. And when it comes to the election, knowing that we already are seeing threats of violence on the rise, this is a real moment for us to show up for one another. And think reaching out is going to be received and held, knowing that there's something immediate that we can do. The other thing I wanna talk about is the importance of planning and preparation. We know again that there's a higher likelihood of political violence this year compared to previous years, and we're seeing already an increase in hate-based violence. Creating a plan for different possibilities is so important. Talking to different clergy, different partners in the community about not just what you'll do, what you'll say, how you'll shepherd your communities, depending on who wins the election, both federally and at the state and local level, but also preparing for different possibilities, right? What happens if the results aren't called on election night? As we know, they likely won't be. What happens if folks might be protesting, on election night? There are different possibilities that are important to consider. And again, it's really important to talk through these things in community with folks you work closely alongside. And I'll say, for those of you on this call, you're invited to a crisis scenario planning session that we'll be doing in partnership with Protect Democracy on Tuesday of next week. You should have all gotten an email about it. If you haven't, if this is the first time you're on one of our calls, you'll be getting that right after this webinar ends. But I want to say this is something we take very seriously, and we are providing opportunities, to start this conversation. I also mentioned this QR code. I'm going to lift it up once again now. There is a program specifically for clergy to show up at the polls and prevent not only political violence, but de-escalate tension, be messengers for truthful information through Faiths United to Save Democracy. As a partner of this effort, we've been reaching out to clergy and faith leaders around the country who are ready to show up in person after de-escalation training to protect and secure our elections. So you can scan that QR code with your phone, go directly to their website. You can access their resources, get involved with future trainings. And I'll say as well, we have some really amazing partners doing de-escalation trainings, intervention trainings. So if your community has specific needs, if you have specific questions, please, as always, feel free to reach out and we'll be happy to make a connection. The third thing we can do to prepare ourselves and our community for this election is to be messengers of truth, right? We know that mis and disinformation is being spread like never before. Analysts and experts are saying that this is our first AI election. And in fact, there was some research that just came out about how the owner of an unnamed social media platform has been sharing so much mis and disinformation that a third of his posts are actually deepfakes and patently misleading. Right? We know that this is a moment where people are being bombarded with a lot of different information, and a lot of it just isn't true. And one thing that is really important for every person who is a clergy member on this call or a faith leader broadly to know is that according to the Ad Council, who did this research just last year, faith leaders are one of the most trusted messengers on specific issues in our country. Right? When a member of clergy gets up and says, we know our elections are safe and secure, we know who the people are in our community who are facilitating them, and we trust our election officials, that message is heard across political divides, and it's heard by people from different walks of life in the community. And that's something that isn't unique to clergy, but it's something that clergy embody more so than almost any other messenger in our country. And so we have here a disinformation guide that we have access to through our partnership with Common Cause and the Lawyers Committee, who are running the Election Protection Hotline this year. It's a really amazing resource that talks not only about best practices for how to debunk mis and disinformation, how to avoid amplifying or resharing it when you do so, but also how to lead with truthful information. And it also has some really great resources on how to message around some of the most relevant disinfo talking points we're seeing in this last month before the election. So now just getting into more of these tangible things we can not only bring to our communities, but our partners as well, some things that we can do as individuals. I know I just mentioned our partnership with the Lawyers Committee and Common Cause. In addition to putting out these really amazing resources on how to counter mis and disinformation, they've also done some incredible work building out volunteer opportunities for folks across the country to show up either in person or virtually and protect our elections. So as an official partner of 866 Our Vote, we are providing this opportunity to everyone, not just on this call, but in your communities, to, again, virtually or in person, be an active member of our society protecting elections. When you scan this QR code, you'll have the opportunity to either volunteer virtually or in person, to either serve as a poll monitor or a poll watcher, which you can do in your community, and you'll receive training through regular calls through the Election Protection Hotline program, or you'll actually be a volunteer on this hotline, right? If you want, either during the early vote period or on election day itself, you can sign up to, from the comfort, the safety of your own home, receive calls or text messages from voters who are having trouble voting, whether they're facing intimidation or just forgot their ID in a state with restrictive voter ID laws. And you'll have the resources and training to be able to walk them through next steps and ensure that they're able to vote. Knowing that across the country right now, and especially in states where we know the election will be decided, we're seeing hundreds of thousands of voters being removed from voter rolls. There were just 2 lawsuits filed in the past 2 weeks to challenge states doing this illegally. This action is especially important. The ability to be not only a messenger of accurate and true information, but respond directly to folks who are facing barriers to participating in our civic process. And then the last thing I want to raise up here is one thing that we're really excited to be leading on as Interfaith Alliance. We are texting voters from minority faith communities in Pennsylvania and in Florida to get out the vote. And in Florida, we're working on Amendment 1, which would make school board elections partisan, potentially disenfranchising over 1 million voters. You can scan this QR code in the bottom left corner right now and sign up for one of our text banking trainings, which will also have a great community of folks that you can join in sending these messages. They're happening every Tuesday and Thursday from now until the election. And you can choose. Do you want to reach out to folks in Pennsylvania? Do you want to reach out to folks in Florida? And you'll also be reaching out with faithful messaging, allusions to faith that remind people across the country and in the states we're reaching out to why voting and engaging in our civic process is a faith value, and why leading with love and empathy is a faith value. And this is something that's one of many different campaigns and initiatives being offered by organizations like ours that you can also organize around at the local, the congregational level. Right? Oftentimes in these moments, it's hard to know exactly how to engage, what to bring to your community. And a question that we often receive is, how do we engage at the federal level? Something I really want to emphasize on this slide is that doing the work at the state level and even in your community is one of the most important things we can do. Not only because we see the results of our work very directly, but we also have the most outsized impact. Right? Some of our school board elections, or even elections at the county or district level, are decided by a margin of less than 1,000 votes. Right? That's something that we'll see every year across states in our country. And doing the work to knock on doors just to get out the vote, bring nonpartisan voter guides into your house of worship to make sure that folks are well versed and educated, which is, again, completely legal under nonpartisan house of worship guidelines. These are tangible things we can do to prepare our community in the lead up to November, and for folks who are early voting over the next few weeks. And then the last thing, again, I just want to lift up here is our issue primer, not just because it's an amazing resource informed by expert researchers and authors focused on countering Christian nationalism, but because on the last page of this resource, there are also some great tangible ways to get involved actively in speaking out against Christian nationalism and organizing as we approach the election. You'll see a whole page of these recommendations on how to engage, as well as a number of other resources from our partners that you can explore, which might be specific to your faith tradition as well. So those are our five tangible, actionable items that you can get involved with ahead of November 5th, ahead of our election. And those first three, again, are things that will not only prepare us for this moment, our election, but for the coming weeks, which we know might be ones that are difficult, where we might not get election results. People might feel anxious and stressed. And as people doing this work through our faith or our core belief, we have the unique ability to guide people through, to give them hope in this moment. And so, on that, I want to turn it back over to Paul to speak a little bit to the unique role congregations can play in doing this work.
I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because I really would love to get into some more conversation. But I do think that, in this moment where we're kind of having like some battles over common space and civic spaces, congregations can be a place and they can really an important place to counteract Christian nationalism and also be a place where we can really try to do and organize a lot of the things that Adam just meant, these five actions. So it's a physical space. So a lot of people, there's a lot of voting that happens in religious spaces, but also, voter protection can happen there. It can be a primary. It can, there's ways to congregate in a congregation space and in order to really show that religion, cares about our democracy in a nonpartisan way. This is a place where if we prepare when hate arises, we can know what we do. We can have a text chain. We can have a rapid response. Congregations showing up as Adam mentioned, it means something when our congregations show up for another congregation. When a gurdwara is defaced, if a Christian congregation shows up and say, "Not in our town, we're not going to accept this," it means something. Or if people are experiencing, some sort of voter suppression or hostility at the polls, it's really congregations can get activated very quickly and can come as their full selves. I think when we're talking about the value of truth, and what it means to counteract lies. I mean, even in this current terrible moment in the wake of Helene and in anticipation of Milton coming, it means something to have a place where you can get real information about what is happening and where are resources and where we can, as opposed to, a lot of disinformation flying around. And so, be a place where if your community has questions about the election, questions about any of this, and especially given what Adam has just laid out, there's a role for religious leadership here, nonpartisan religious leadership to support democracy. And then we talked about our guide and our messaging guide. Congregations can be a place where we discuss like what is the values that we hold and what does it matter right now for our shared democracy, a shared future. So it's really important that people of every faith tradition as well as other civic spaces come together. And I think right now, we want to close just with a moment like of hope, that there have been very difficult times before, that we have had challenges, and yet, like when we, just call upon our better angels, as I think Lincoln suggested and encouraged us in this moment, when we look towards our neighbors and really understand, okay, I want to show up with you in this moment of our democracy, in this crisis moment of our democracy. This is an opportunity where we can show actually the idea of America as a multi-religious, multiracial, people from all over the world are equally welcome. We can show that in the way we act over the next several weeks, and then into turning kind of this idea of the promise of the future, promise 2025, what the future can hold for this country, and holding on to that and casting that vision and making that vision real in our actions right now and how we show up for one another right now. So with that, I think Adam, I'll give it back to Adam, and we can invite some questions, conversation with the remaining few minutes we have.
Thank you so much, Paul, for closing with that message of hope and aspiration as to what our country can be. Um, I just put up, this is our last QR code. As you can tell, I'm a big fan of them. If you are not yet signed up for our emails, we are going to have information continue to be sent out to folks about what you can do in the lead up to this election, as well as kind of broadly what we're seeing come out of the Christian nationalist camp and what you can do about that. So please, if you haven't yet, scan this QR code, get on our list, and we will make sure that you have the latest information on how to counter Christian nationalism in your inbox. We have a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen on Zoom here. I do see someone has asked a question. Feel free, folks, to send in your questions. Paul, this is our first question is, what is the worst case scenario on election day and how can we respond?
That is subjective. I think one of my what is to be expected is that we will not know the full election results on election day. I think we should expect that. What is what would be a bad scenario would be for a candidate to declare victory before the votes were counted. There's no way that some of the states, who don't begin to count absentee ballots or mail-in ballots until the day of the election, there's no way they will be able to know who has won. And what I am worried is that someone may try to short circuit the election. I am worried about intimidation at the polls. I mean, you asked for one. What's the worst case? I am worried that we're going to have that we are going to have intimidation at the polls. I am worried that that polling stations will become politicized to such an extent that we find violence actually erupting at polling stations. And so, I think that's what I worry about most. I think that, the best we can do right now is try to create safeguards around our poll workers and also around, all the opportunities to support, voters when I think there's so much disinformation out there. So, but the worst case scenario for me would be for the election to be short circuited intentionally in order to just to throw the country into chaos.
See, we have another question here. What messages have you found work for Christian nationalists to turn more toward a pro-democracy stance? It's hard to fight against the spiritual good versus evil framework. It's very true. It's very absolutist. Are they even open to changing their minds if everlasting life is at stake?
That's a really excellent question. I think there is work to be done with hardcore Christian nationalists. That's not really the work that I think, at least Interfaith Alliance is not doing that exact sort of person-to-person convincing. What we are doing is helping those who are just who hear the idea, oh, we're a Christian nation, go, okay, and haven't really had the chance to think about it and what that implies for their neighbor who may not be Christian. And so what I think the opportunity is to really, for those who you feel like are open to a conversation, is to really say, like, what is, here's the thing. There is so many, there is polling that many people think it's a Christian nation. At the same time, people don't, they also say they want to live in a religiously diverse nation. In fact, 75% of Americans say they want to live in a religiously diverse America. So we can fall into this. We don't want to give them the ground of what is real. We want to just say, dude, isn't it great that we are religiously diverse? Isn't it like a blessing that we have all of these people living together and it's an opportunity for us to grow and learn from one another? Do you have any friends who are from a different religious tradition? Don't you think democracy is worth saving? I mean, I think beginning with questions, but right now, I think in the immediate term, it's less about kind of there are people who are very involved and they tend to be from charismatic Pentecostal religious traditions who are heading straight into the good versus evil spiritual battle and really having conversations rooted in their own tradition where that lives. I don't think, unless you have a passion for that, I think the better work is for those who are persuadable to pull them in and invite them into a different kind of vision for the future. And somehow invite them and say, like, God, I hate that you're like living in a culture of fear of the other instead of like figuring out ways that we can all be valuable together, and to invite them to step out of the center that they insist on being the center of the American religious landscape and invite them to be part of the circle. I mean, that's really like, the opportunity. It's not erasing anybody. It's inviting people to be part of a broader community.
If I could just add one thing, there's been a lot of research done this year, most notably by the AP NORC poll that came out a few months back that shows people, regardless of political party, are concerned about our democracy. I think it's over two-thirds, and in some cases up to three-quarters of Democrats, Republicans, and independents. And while this does say something about concerns around this election, concerns about the health of our democracy, it also affirms that people care about our democracy. There was a new poll today that came out of a leading polling institute that said less than 7% of Americans actually display active anti-authoritarian attitudes, right? People are concerned. There's certainly that slide in the openness. And I think it's really telling that, there are significantly more people who believe in Christian nationalism that are worried about their democracy, our democracy as an idea, than there are folks who openly are calling for an authoritarian state. And I think that in itself is a way in, right? Talking about shared values, like Paul mentioned, reminding people of what democracy can be. And I'll say one thing that a lot of folks in the more political world are talking about right now is as a tactic is talking about nostalgia through commonality as a way to kind of bridge divides in this area. Right, remembering what a healthy functioning democracy has felt like in the past, right, where people have equal opportunity. How do we get back there? It's not through violence. It's through reaching out to one another to build understanding. And so, Paul, we have two more questions here. And let's see, this first one I'd love to pose to you is what role can youth play in shaping community responses to hate-based violence in the lead up to elections?
You're the young one. What am I supposed to? Why is that mine? I think that come on, really. What are the youth saying? I get to put on my old fogey hat here and turn that back to you.
Oh my God. Well, you did mention you turned 60. You're really embracing it.
I'm so embracing it. But I mean, yeah, I think I will say one thing is that I don't know. I I am heartened by how aware young people are in this moment about what's happening, and how committed they are. A lot of frustration, but also at the same time a deep commitment to making the United States a better country, um, continuing to expand the rights of people. So I think it's important to figure out, if I'm thinking back to the way our conversation for the first 45 minutes went, a lot of times the things we're talking about sound like older people doing stuff rather than young people being invited to help lead stuff. So if we think about even, and I've worked in churches and I've worked in universities and a lot of different settings where religion is at play. And if we think of the leaders rather than necessarily the elders of a congregation or the clergy, but also who are the young people who actually feel very passionate about this? How do you enfranchise them? How do you get them stepping up? I think it'd make a huge difference in the way the whole experience feels and the stakes. So that's one thing I would just invite for those of you who are in settings where there are youth, to invite them into leadership roles, into whatever plans are being made.
It's a phenomenal answer. Um, I just add around this piece of hate-based violence that we know radicalization and the propensity for hate-based violence is increasingly uh, catalyzed online, which is a place that, as a young person, I can say I am chronically on. And I know many folks my age are as well. And there's also a lot of research that's been done in the past year that shows, especially young men, um, folks that are 26 and under are increasingly isolated and feel alone. I think it's the latest is around 1 in 7 young men don't belong to any group, whether that's a social group, an organization or club, a team, anything like that. And so I think there's this kind of there are these different factors coming together to create the situation where young people, especially young men, can go online to communities that only exist virtually for the most part, engage with content that's very radicalizing, and not actually have a support network in person to really process this information or escape it. And so, as a young person who's seen people, especially back when I was in undergrad and high school growing up, fall into that pipeline, I think one of the biggest things we can do is reach out, right? Young people at the community level can not only shape the response by getting involved, but by sharing exactly what's happening in these online spaces, because young people know what's happening there better than anyone else. And young people are also the best folks to reach out to other young people who might be at risk for this kind of radicalization, right? Not only as a humanizing figure, right? For me, as a Jewish person, if I was hearing somebody make anti-Semitic Holocaust jokes back when I was in high school, I would go talk to them and explain the experience of my grandparents fleeing hate-based persecution in Eastern Europe and coming to the United States, and often that would change their tone. But young people are also able to build different kinds of communities in person, or at least virtual communities that have a geographic component, right? Communities of like folks in the same school playing games together, or things like that. That gets people out of this kind of loneliness epidemic that can enable hate-based violence, or at least exposure to information that catalyzes it. We have a couple more questions. These are great questions. Think if we could go to this question from, thank you, Michael, for asking, how can you counter online disinformation in real time? And then there's a great question that I think would be nice for us to end on right after that. But Paul, do you want to start with this question about countering online disinformation in real time?
I think that this is chronic difficulty, but you can point it out in real time as well. And there, I think it's kind of beholden on all of us. Sometimes just what you don't want to do is elevate misinformation even by like clicking on it or forwarding it, then like algorithmically it expands no matter what. And so, but I think it's good to for those of us who are online a lot, and I'm also online a lot, and a lot of my work has been about online communication, um, is to, when you see things that are spreading disinformation, not to amplify that, but to actually offer, say, I've saw this online, this is factually incorrect. You can take a screenshot and you can put it so you're not clicking on it or forwarding it. And say, this is very clearly, here's where you can find this information on, this website, whether it's a governmental website, whether it's something reputable, just so people are also going to see other people pushing back. A lot of online disinformation is done by bots. It's like done by what do you call that? It's AI but generated, but also just like, it's swarming. But we also, this is part of what, I think it means to be a leader, is to be a place where someone can go to for honest information. And as much as possible, that's on all of us to supply that. You can flag things online. There's lots of, there are tools that, supposedly social media outlets are trying to push back. But a lot of times it's just, I think it's not so good to engage necessarily in a back and forth or anything like that. Again, you might be talking to a robot, but to find ways to offer real information in real time is, I think, our best antidote to it.
Thank you. And I just the last thing, I don't think there's anything to add past that, but there are some really great, helpful best practices that have come from our partners who put this disinformation guide together. So I really encourage you, if you're thinking about how to counter mis and disinformation, to scan this QR code, read through this information guide, and lean on those best practices. Paul, especially just lifting up what you said about not amplifying disinformation when we address it. So we have a minute left here. I think this is a really great question to end on. And I wonder if you could answer this and then as we like to do at Interfaith Alliance, give us a little hope before we go about the rest of our evenings. How do you respond to critics from the left who say we've never been a democracy?
I think they're right. I mean, I think we've always been fighting. We've always been fighting to widen the circle of people whose vote counts. We have recent history of people, gaining the right to vote. There, this has been from the beginning, we were not a democracy in the sense that it was very restricted who had the right to vote. And over the years, more people have been included in our democracy. And throughout that entire time, there have been forces that have tried to stop it and didn't want that to happen and didn't want more people to matter and didn't want more voices to count. And that has always been true. And so if people on the left want to say that, I say absolutely right. And what are we doing now to continue to expand the voices that count, the voices, and to make sure that every voice is counted? And I think that this is something, how do we imagine becoming a more perfect union, recognizing that we will never get there, but we can take steps towards it. And the only way that progress will not happen is if we allow ourselves to give up hope in the future and to lose vision of what can happen in our world and in our democracy. And so, I have a hard time sometimes with the arc of the universe is long, but bends towards justice. I mean, it's hard to think that. It's hard to have hope all the time around that. And sometimes that line is going to be really, really jagged. But the only option we have is to move forward. The only option we have is to continue to believe that we can do better than we have done. And the great thinkers that are the people who really have inspired me over the years, are one of the greatest was James Baldwin, who talked about what will it take to achieve our country, And it will be a small group of people who just are convinced that we have to work alongside one another in order to make that happen. He said it much more eloquently. And Interfaith Alliance, we have used that idea for our tagline, achieving democracy together. This idea, that's a question that's up to us. And so I invite us to accept the challenge, recognizing the truth of that critique, but letting that be an inspiration and a North Star for the future.
Thank you so much. Thanks for this reminder to lean back in because of the amount of work there is left to do, knowing that we can do it together. With that, we really appreciate you all joining us this evening to talk about how democracy is in the balance, not just this election season, but in this moment and in the moments following our election. We really hope that you learned something tonight. You'll be able to share these resources with your partners, your colleagues, your community, and we look forward to seeing you on our next call. Thanks all. Take care.
Thank you.